Caitlin Bryant had moved to the countryside to escape noise, rules, and people who always had opinions about how others should live. After years in the city, surrounded by neighbors who complained about everything from her recycling bins to the sound of her music, she had promised herself peace. The old farmhouse she bought sat at the edge of a wooded ridge, where the road turned to gravel and phone signals grew weak. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. 2 acres of uneven land, an aging well drilled decades ago, and the sweet, constant hum of cicadas at night. The property came with quirks, uneven plumbing, a creaky porch, and a pump system that sounded like it was built before she was born. But to Caitlin, that soft mechanical buzz of the well was the sound of freedom. No monthly utility bills, no dependence on anyone else's infrastructure. The well water was clean and cold, a natural gift that made her feel more self-reliant than ever before. For the first few months, everything felt perfect. She restored the garden, patched up the fence, and planted herbs along the walkway. The air was different here, thicker, calmer, filled with the scent of pine and distant rain. Sometimes, when she watered her plants at dusk, she'd look out at the tree line and feel an odd satisfaction knowing that every drop came from beneath her own soil. When the local homeowners association sent a welcome packet, she skimmed it and filed it away. The HOA wasn't mandatory for her part of the ridge, though the president, Susan Miller, seemed to think otherwise. Caitlin had met her once, a perfectly coiffed woman in her 50s with an assertive smile and an air of ownership that didn't stop at her own property line. Their interaction had been brief, but left a bitter taste. Susan talked as if every home in the area was part of her personal empire. Caitlin ignored her, determined not to let anyone turn her rural retreat into another suburb of control and gossip. Then, one humid evening in July, Caitlin noticed something strange. The well pump, usually quiet after sundown, was still running long after she'd finished her chores. The sound carried through the open windows, steady, low, mechanical. She stepped outside expecting to see a dripping hose or a leak somewhere along the irrigation line, but everything seemed normal. The next morning, her electricity monitor showed an unusually high reading. The pump had consumed almost twice as much energy as usual. She assumed it was a fluke, a sensor glitch, maybe the heat wave, but the pattern continued. Week after week, her power bills climbed and the well ran harder than ever. When she timed the cycles, she realized it barely stopped, pumping as if someone, somewhere, was draining her water non-stop. At first, Caitlin tried to rationalize it. Maybe a pipe had cracked underground, or one of her lines had developed a leak. She checked the fixtures, inspected the yard for soft ground, but nothing was out of place. The well technician she called frowned as he studied the readings. "You've got an external draw," he finally said, his tone cautious. "Like a secondary outlet pulling water continuously. Someone might have tapped into the line." Caitlin felt her stomach drop. "Tapped in? You mean another connection?" The man nodded. "Yeah, it happens sometimes. People run hoses, install connectors. They think nobody will notice." She followed him to the side of her property, where a thin trench ran along the fence line, barely visible, as if someone had recently filled it in. A section of soft dirt gave way under her foot, revealing the edge of a narrow plastic pipe. It wasn't part of her system. Her heart started to race as they traced it toward the back of the property, through the thicket of ivy, where it disappeared under the fence separating her land from the house uphill. Caitlin didn't need to check the records to know who lived there. The white colonial with trimmed hedges and the HOA flag fluttering from the porch belonged to Susan Miller. For a moment, Caitlin just stood there, staring at the faint trail of disturbed soil leading straight to the HOA president's backyard. The realization hit with slow, cold clarity. Her water, her electricity, her money had been feeding someone else's convenience. The technician offered to seal the connection, but Caitlin stopped him. "Not yet," she said quietly. "I want to be sure." That night she lay awake, listening to the rhythmic hum of the pump through the floorboards. Each vibration felt like a taunt, a steady reminder that somewhere next door someone was taking what was hers. It wasn't just theft. It was intrusion, disguised as neighborly civility, and Caitlin, who had moved here to escape control, was beginning to realize she might have stepped into something far worse. The next morning began like any other, but something in Caitlin's chest was already tight with unease. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her half-finished cup of coffee as the sound of the well pump droned steadily through the floor. She'd become acutely aware of that sound now, how it never seemed to rest, how it carried through the pipes like a slow heartbeat that didn't belong to her. By noon, she decided she couldn't let it go another day. She drove into town and bought a set of motion sensor cameras, the kind used for wildlife surveillance, small enough to hide among the ferns near the well. Installing them took hours. The sun was brutal. Sweat soaked through her shirt, and the whole time she imagined the steady pull of water from below, someone else's taps running freely while she labored in the heat. When she finally secured the last camera, she crouched beside the well casing and whispered to herself, "Let's see who's thirsty." 2 nights later, the footage confirmed what she already suspected but refused to believe outright. The screen showed 2 men arriving just after midnight, their truck's headlights off, the dull flash of a phone guiding them toward the fence line. They wore reflective vests, professional, calm, practiced. One knelt by the hidden pipe while the other held a flashlight, their movements precise, as if they'd done it a dozen times. The man at the pipe twisted something, checked a gauge, nodded, and both disappeared back up the hill toward Susan Miller's house. Caitlin replayed the footage 3 times, the dull click of the pump echoing in her mind like a ticking clock. She felt a wave of anger so sharp it made her breath hitch. 8 months. 8 months of rising bills, sleepless nights, and second-guessing herself. And all along, her neighbor had been stealing from her. The next morning, she walked straight up the hill, through the immaculate gravel path that led to Susan's porch. The lawn looked like it had been cut with surgical precision, and every flower bed was perfect, hydrated, alive. The sprinklers were running even though the county had issued a drought warning. Susan opened the door before Caitlin could knock. Her smile was thin, controlled, the expression of someone who already knew what this was about but intended to win before the first word was spoken. "Caitlin," she said brightly. "What a surprise. Everything all right?" Caitlin held up her phone, the paused frame of the video visible on the screen, the 2 men crouched by the pipe. "Do these look familiar?" she asked, her voice low. Susan didn't even glance down. "I don't know what you think you're showing me, but you're trespassing. You can't come up here making accusations." Caitlin felt her hands tremble with fury. "You've been using my well water for months," she said. "My technician found your line. You've been draining my system and tripling my bills. That's theft, Susan. You know it." For a moment, the HOA president's face hardened, the veneer of politeness cracking. Then she laughed softly, a patronizing sound that made Caitlin's stomach twist. "You're mistaken. The HOA installed shared utility access years ago. Maybe you should read the bylaws before making such dramatic claims." Caitlin's eyes narrowed. "My property isn't part of your association, and you know that. There's no shared utility. There never was." Susan stepped closer, her perfume sharp and artificial. "You live in this community. You benefit from its maintenance. Maybe it's time you start contributing instead of picking fights." The implication was clear. She was untouchable, shielded by paperwork, allies, and her title. Caitlin turned and walked away before her rage could spill into words she couldn't take back. That afternoon, she contacted the county water authority. The representative on the line listened politely, then told her the association had filed a temporary water management easement covering multiple properties along the ridge, including hers. The permit had been signed 8 months ago by Susan Miller. It was legal, at least on paper, but there was no record of Caitlin's consent. Her voice shook as she argued, explaining that her well was private, that she never agreed to share it. The clerk's tone was apologetic but firm. "Ma'am, the paperwork lists your parcel number. If you believe it's fraudulent, you'll need to take it up with the HOA or an attorney." That evening, Caitlin stood by her well as the sun set behind the trees. The hum of the pump vibrated through the air like a living thing. She crouched beside the casing and pressed her palm against the cool metal, trying to imagine the path the water took. Down, through the rock, then siphoned off into another yard, another set of pipes feeding someone else's comfort. It felt invasive, almost intimate, as if someone had reached inside her home and taken something essential. She thought about the footage again, the way the men had moved with confidence, like they belonged there. That was what unsettled her most. They believed they had the right. When darkness fell, she went inside and began gathering every document she had. The property deed, the well permit, the inspection reports. Each page was another reminder that she owned what they were stealing. She spread them out across her kitchen table until there was no space left, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of the legal language. She found no mention of any shared easement, no HOA jurisdiction. It was all lies, fabricated on paper, designed to look official. She realized then that this wasn't just about water. It was about control, the same kind she thought she'd escaped when she left the city. Susan Miller didn't just want to steal from her. She wanted to put her in her place, to remind her that even out here, freedom came with a price and a hierarchy. Late that night, Caitlin sat by the window with the lights off, watching the faint glow of Susan's garden lights up the hill. She could see the sprinklers turning in perfect arcs, misting the flowers long past midnight. The pump kicked on again, louder than ever, and she imagined the water surging through the underground pipe, disappearing into the neighbor's perfect lawn. A mix of helplessness and fury pressed against her chest, but beneath it was something colder. Resolve. She wouldn't call the HOA again, and she wouldn't let Susan twist the truth in another meeting. Tomorrow she would go to the county clerk's office herself, file a report, and find a lawyer who wasn't afraid of the woman everyone else in town seemed to fear. As she closed her laptop, she caught her reflection in the window, tired, angry, but alive with something fierce. For months, she had dismissed the noise of the pump as harmless background, but now she heard it differently. It was the sound of a line being crossed, of someone quietly trespassing into her life. She didn't know yet how far Susan had gone, or how much of the community was complicit, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. Whatever it took, she was going to make Susan Miller pay for every drop she had stolen. Caitlin barely slept the following nights, her thoughts circling the same realization over and over again. She wasn't simply dealing with theft. She was standing against an organized system that had already decided she was the problem. The morning she received the first formal letter from the HOA, the irony of it nearly made her laugh. The envelope, printed with the association's gold-embossed logo, accused her of unapproved alterations to community utilities and warned that fines would begin accruing immediately if she failed to cooperate. It was dated 2 days after her confrontation with Susan. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. It was retaliation, neat and bureaucratic. Caitlin read it 3 times, her pulse hammering louder with each line. She wasn't a member of the HOA. They had no authority over her property, and yet here they were, sending threats dressed as policy. The letter ended with a chilling line. Failure to comply may result in suspension of water privileges. It was almost comical if it weren't so malicious. suspension of water privileges for water that belonged solely to her. That same afternoon, a county inspector arrived without notice. He introduced himself politely but avoided her eyes as he explained that an anonymous complaint had been filed about possible contamination near her well. Caitlin guided him through the property, watching as he photographed everything, the pump, the soil, even her garden. When she asked who had filed the complaint, he said he couldn't disclose it. But she didn't need to ask. She already knew. By the time he left, leaving a stack of forms and an uneasy silence behind, Caitlin's patience had hardened into something sharper. She wasn't going to let Susan bully her through paperwork. That evening, she returned to the footage from her cameras, hoping for more evidence. What she saw instead sent a wave of cold anger through her. The same two men had returned, this time during daylight hours, parking a maintenance van marked with the HOA logo by the fence. They weren't checking for contamination. They were reconnecting the pipe she had severed. One of them even looked toward her house, smiling faintly as if daring her to come out. Caitlin slammed her laptop shut, grabbed her phone, and started dialing the police. The dispatcher's tone was neutral, bordering on disinterested, and by the time an officer finally arrived, the van was gone. The officer, a young man barely out of training, glanced at the disturbed soil, then at her cameras, and sighed. "Ma'am," he said, scratching his head, "if this is about a property dispute, it's civil, not criminal. You'll have to take it up with your homeowners association." Caitlin's voice shook. "I'm not part of their damn association. They've been stealing my water for months." The officer's gaze flickered with discomfort before he mumbled something about jurisdiction and walked back to his patrol car. When he drove away, the sound of his tires crunching down the gravel road echoed like betrayal. For the first time, Caitlin felt truly alone out here. The HOA wasn't just powerful. They were connected, shielded by the kind of small-town loyalty that treated anyone challenging them as an outsider. And she, the quiet woman who kept to herself at the edge of the woods, had just become the enemy. The following morning, a group of neighbors stood near the bottom of her driveway. They weren't overtly hostile, but their crossed arms and wary expressions spoke volumes. One of them, a man she'd only seen in passing, stepped forward and asked if it was true she'd accused the HOA president of theft. Caitlin hesitated, trying to gauge whether this was a genuine question or a trap. "Yes," she said carefully, "because it's the truth. I have proof." The man shook his head, muttering something about misunderstandings and Susan's generosity. Another woman added that Susan had helped fix a burst pipe last year, free of charge. It dawned on Caitlin then that Susan had spent years weaving a web of favors and quiet control, binding these people to her through small debts and tokens of kindness. They didn't see her as manipulative. They saw her as the woman who kept their lawns green and their complaints handled. Caitlin realized she wasn't just fighting for water. She was fighting a reputation war, and Susan had started it long before Caitlin even moved in. That night, the pump roared louder than ever. Caitlin stood on her porch, staring at the small light on the casing, blinking in a steady rhythm like a pulse. She felt the weight of exhaustion pressing against her, but anger kept her steady. She couldn't sleep knowing that her well was being siphoned dry again. Around midnight, she grabbed a flashlight and walked down the slope toward the fence. The air was thick, the moonlight dim behind clouds. When she reached the trench, she crouched and ran her hand along the soil, feeling the faint warmth of water still running beneath. Without hesitation, she followed the pipe to where it met the dividing line, knelt, and began digging with her bare hands. The earth gave way easily, and soon the plastic connector was visible. She twisted it hard, snapping it loose, and the sound of rushing water gurgled into silence. The next morning, her pounding at her door startled her awake. Susan stood outside, immaculate as ever, flanked by two men in suits who introduced themselves as Association representatives. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with fury. "You've vandalized HOA property," she said. "We have every right to access shared resources under Community Ordinance 14B. Caitlin stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "My property is not part of your community, and if you step 1 foot past that fence again, I'll have you charged with trespassing." One of the men smirked and produced a folder. "You might want to reconsider that, Ms. Bryant. These documents outline shared resource boundaries filed with the county. You can verify them yourself." He handed her the folder and turned to leave, as though the matter was already settled. Caitlin stood frozen, gripping the papers, watching them walk back up the road toward Susan's gleaming SUV. Inside, she opened the folder, her stomach twisting as she scanned the contents. The documents were copies of property maps, permits, signatures, all official-looking. But the signature that was supposed to be hers wasn't. It was forged, a crude imitation of her handwriting. Her name had been used to authorize temporary shared usage of groundwater resources. Her heart pounded as she realized how far Susan had gone. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a boundary error. It was deliberate fraud. She took photographs of every page, uploaded them to a secure folder, and then called the one person who might be willing to listen, a local attorney named Emily Ward, known for taking cases others wouldn't touch. By the time Caitlin finished explaining everything, her voice was hoarse. Emily was quiet for a long time before replying. "You're not the first person Susan's tried to push out. But this is the first time she's forged documents. If we can prove it, she's done." For the first time in weeks, Caitlin felt a flicker of hope. But it came with a warning edge, because people like Susan didn't lose quietly. That night, as the wind swept through the trees and the hum of the pump finally faded into silence, Caitlin stood by the window staring up the hill. The lights in Susan's house burned late, unnaturally bright. She could almost feel the woman's eyes behind the glass, watching, calculating, already planning her next move. Caitlin whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. If she wants a war, she's got one. The meeting at the attorney's office marked the moment Caitlin understood that this was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a campaign, and she had been its target long before she ever knew. Emily Ward, calm and deliberate, spread out the forged documents across her desk, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating the precise yet fraudulent signature that had set everything in motion. "This isn't amateur work," she said, her tone low but certain. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing. The forms were filed electronically through the county portal, and the metadata was scrubbed. That means they had access to administrative channels. Caitlin's stomach tightened as she tried to process the idea that Susan had not only stolen her water, but corrupted official records to do it. The level of confidence required to manipulate county systems so brazenly meant this wasn't an impulsive crime. It was part of a pattern. Emily looked at her client for a long moment before continuing. "I've handled cases against homeowner associations before, but this one's different. They've insulated themselves legally. Every complaint you make will be met with counterclaims until you run out of energy or money. The only way through this is to collect irrefutable evidence, documents, recordings, witnesses. Once we file, we need to make sure it hits hard enough that they can't bury it." Caitlin nodded, though her throat felt dry. She wasn't used to this kind of war, where every move required proof and precision, where outrage and truth weren't enough. She left the office with a thick folder of paperwork and instructions, the cool air outside feeling almost foreign against her flushed skin. In the following weeks, Caitlin's life became an exhausting cycle of observation, documentation, and fear. She recorded every sound the well made, every fluctuation in her electric meter, every suspicious vehicle parked along the ridge. Her nights were filled with the hum of electronics, the soft click of cameras, the low whir of hard drives saving footage. But paranoia was no longer paranoia when the evidence supported it. 2 weeks into her surveillance, she caught something new, a meeting taking place in Susan Miller's backyard. 5 people gathered around a patio table, papers spread before them, voices hushed but urgent. She zoomed in through her telephoto lens and caught snippets of conversation through the directional mic she had borrowed from Emily's office. The words easement dispute, non-compliance, and transfer of resource rights surfaced repeatedly. One man, a county clerk named Rhodes, whose name Caitlin would later find on the filed permits, was laughing. "No one checks these forms anyway," he said. "By the time she contests, the renewal window will be closed." Susan's reply was cool, precise. "Good. I want this settled before the next HOA audit. She'll either join or she'll sell." That recording became the first piece of real evidence tying Susan's influence to the county administration. Emily filed an initial complaint, attaching the audio transcript, copies of Caitlin's original property deed, and a notarized statement confirming that no such easement had ever been authorized. Within days, the reaction was swift and vicious. Caitlin began receiving letters from the HOA's attorney accusing her of harassment, defamation, and illegal surveillance of private property. Someone spray-painted the word thief on her mailbox in dripping red paint, a cruel inversion of the truth. At night, headlights lingered on her driveway longer than they should have. The message was clear. Stop fighting or face consequences. But Caitlin was past the point of retreat. She had proof, and for the first time, people were beginning to see it. The turning point came when a reporter from a regional paper contacted Emily after a quiet tip-off. The journalist, a young man named Leo Carter, had been following a series of small corruption cases involving homeowners associations that manipulated zoning laws to seize private land. When he arrived at Caitlin's house, she expected skepticism, but instead he listened intently, recording everything, asking precise questions about the forged documents, the fraudulent easement, and the stolen water. "This isn't just local politics," he said afterward. "This is organized fraud. I've seen 3 other cases in nearby counties. Different HOAs, same pattern. Fake easements, forged approvals, resource redirection. Yours might be the one that connects them." Caitlin felt an odd mix of validation and dread. What had started as a personal violation was now part of something systemic, bigger and darker than she had imagined. When the article went live 2 weeks later, it caused exactly the kind of storm Susan had hoped to avoid. The headline: HOA president accused of fraudulent resource seizure, water theft allegations under investigation. Spread across social media, igniting outrage among residents and curiosity among local officials. Susan responded with a carefully worded public statement claiming the accusations were misguided and born of personal misunderstanding. She painted Caitlin as a disgruntled newcomer, trying to undermine community harmony. But the tone of defensiveness in her statement betrayed a hint of panic. The more Susan tried to control the narrative, the more cracks appeared in her facade. Other residents began whispering about odd discrepancies in their own utility bills, and one elderly neighbor, Mr. Hanley, approached Caitlin privately with documents showing that his own property had been subjected to unexplained maintenance adjustments billed through the HOA. He had never requested them. Meanwhile, Emily's investigation uncovered something even more damning. Internal emails between Susan and a contractor hired by the HOA, referencing redistribution pipelines and resource balancing through secondary channels. The language was vague enough to sound bureaucratic, but clear enough to anyone who knew how to read between the lines. The contractor, pressed under legal threat, eventually admitted in a written statement that he had installed auxiliary connections between multiple properties under Susan's direction, including Caitlin's. When Emily read that statement aloud, Caitlin felt her chest tighten with a mix of vindication and disgust. The fraud wasn't just about her. It had been a systematic operation to cut costs and divert resources from unmonitored wells, feeding the lush lawns and gardens of the HOA elite. But victory came with a price. The moment the evidence surfaced, Susan escalated her counterattack. She filed a lawsuit accusing Caitlin of trespassing, interference with infrastructure, and emotional distress. The HOA board issued a neighborhood-wide notice condemning malicious defamation and illegal surveillance, effectively turning Caitlin into a social outcast. When she went into town, people avoided her gaze. At the grocery store, whispers followed her down the aisles. The isolation gnawed at her, but beneath it burned something stronger than humiliation: resolve. She had lived her entire adult life avoiding confrontation, always choosing silence over conflict. Now silence would mean surrender, and surrender meant letting Susan rewrite reality. Emily filed a counterclaim the next morning, attaching the contractor's affidavit and requesting a formal injunction to prevent the HOA from accessing Caitlin's property. The hearing was scheduled for early spring. It wasn't a final trial, but it would determine whether the HOA had the right to continue using her well pending the outcome of the investigation. Caitlin spent the days leading up to it in a fog of nervous anticipation. At night, the hum of the pump still haunted her dreams, though now she knew exactly what it represented. A symbol of stolen autonomy, of a quiet war waged under the pretense of community. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Susan arrived in a pristine white suit, flanked by lawyers and smiling tightly for the cameras. Caitlin, dressed simply and holding her folder of evidence, felt outnumbered but not outmatched. Inside the courtroom, the arguments unfolded like a chess match. Susan's attorney accused Caitlin of fabricating claims and manipulating recordings. Emily countered with the signed contractor statement, the forged documents, and the audio clip of Susan's backyard conversation with the county clerk. The judge listened quietly, flipping through exhibits with an increasingly furrowed brow. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the slow weight of authority. "I see enough here to warrant a full investigation into the association's practices. Until then, all connections to Ms. Bryant's well are to be terminated immediately." Caitlin didn't smile when she heard the ruling. She was too exhausted to celebrate, but she felt something shift deep inside, like the first exhale after holding her breath for too long. Susan's expression didn't falter as the gavel struck, but Caitlin saw it in her eyes. The first flicker of fear. For months, Susan had operated under the illusion of control, manipulating systems and people alike. Now the cracks were visible, and once they appeared, they would spread. Outside, as the crowd dispersed, Caitlin stood under the pale sunlight, the air cool and sharp against her skin. Reporters shouted questions, flashes popped, and Emily guided her through it with quiet efficiency. For the first time since moving to the ridge, Caitlin felt something close to power, not dominance, but clarity. She had forced the truth into the light, and even if Susan tried to twist it again, it could no longer be hidden. But she also understood that the fight wasn't over. People like Susan didn't crumble after one loss. They regrouped, rearmed, and came back harder. Still, as Caitlin drove home that afternoon, past the dry lawns and closed blinds of the neighborhood that had turned its back on her, she felt an unfamiliar calm. The hum of the well was gone, replaced by silence, a silence that finally belonged to her. The silence that followed the court's injunction was deceptive. For a few days, the air around Caitlin's property felt still, almost peaceful, as if the land itself was exhaling after months of violation. The pump no longer groaned through the nights, and her power readings fell back to normal. She could stand on her porch and hear nothing but wind and cicadas, the kind of quiet she had once dreamed about. But peace, she quickly realized, was only the eye of the storm. When people like Susan Miller lost control, they didn't retreat. They retaliated. And this time, she would do it not through direct theft, but through manipulation of perception, turning the neighborhood itself into a weapon. It began with subtle signs, the kind that made Caitlin question whether she was imagining things. Her mailbox filled with anonymous flyers accusing her of wasting community resources and jeopardizing property values. Her garbage bins were overturned twice in 1 week, though the security cameras showed nothing but a shadow at the edge of the frame. Then came the noise. Late at night, as she lay in bed, trucks would idle briefly outside her gate before driving off. The sounds were short, deliberate bursts meant to disrupt sleep rather than destroy. The next morning, Susan would wave from her driveway with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Emily warned her that this was a psychological tactic, an attempt to exhaust her before the main legal confrontation. The investigation ordered by the court had uncovered new irregularities in the HOA's finances. Unexplained transfers, duplicate invoices, missing maintenance funds, and Susan was under mounting pressure from her own board. Yet instead of admitting defeat, she doubled down, painting herself as the victim of a malicious smear campaign led by an unstable woman with a vendetta. She held a special HOA meeting that week, inviting every resident in the community except Caitlin. The next morning, Caitlin woke to find that the path to her mailbox had been blocked by orange cones labeled community property under repair. When she tried to move them, a man she didn't recognize appeared from across the street, filming her on his phone. "Destroying HOA property again, Miss Bryant," he said mockingly. Caitlin froze, realizing the trap. Anything she did now could be twisted into evidence of aggression. She turned, walked back to her porch, and shut the door, her hands shaking with restrained fury. Inside, she called Emily, who told her to document everything but avoid confrontation. "They want to bait you," the lawyer said. "You're winning legally, but they'll try to make you lose publicly." That night, Caitlin sat at her kitchen table, watching footage from her cameras. Around 2 a.m., she saw 2 figures in dark clothing at the edge of her property, one crouching near the well, the other holding a flashlight. Her breath caught as she zoomed in. They weren't reconnecting the stolen pipe this time. They were damaging her equipment. By morning, the well casing was cracked, the lock on the access panel broken. It would cost hundreds to repair. She called the sheriff's office again, but when the deputy arrived, his tone was cautious, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Miller's already filed a report," he said, reading from his notes. "She claims you've been tampering with shared utilities again. Says she's got video evidence." Caitlin's mouth fell open. "She's lying," she said, her voice rising. "She sent those people here. I have footage of them on my land." The deputy shifted uneasily. "I'm not saying I don't believe you, ma'am, but both parties are filing complaints. Maybe it's best if you let the legal process play out." His words were bureaucratic, but his expression betrayed discomfort. He didn't want to get involved in something that smelled political. By the time he left, Caitlin's faith in local authority had crumbled completely. She realized she was standing alone against a machine designed to protect itself. The HOA's connections reached deeper than she had understood. Susan wasn't just a manipulative neighbor. She was a woman who understood how to bend systems until they broke around her, and now she was using those systems to slowly strangle Caitlin's credibility. The following week, Caitlin received a letter from the county zoning office stating that her property would be subject to a compliance inspection due to allegations of unauthorized construction and unsafe utilities. The irony was almost unbearable. Susan had filed yet another false claim, this time suggesting that Caitlin's well pump violated environmental regulations. If the inspection went poorly, the county could fine her or even shut down her well entirely. She spent 2 sleepless nights gathering every permit and maintenance report, triple-checking that everything was in order. When the inspectors arrived, their demeanor was oddly formal, their questions rehearsed. "We're just following up on community complaints," one of them said. Caitlin handed over her paperwork with steady hands, but her voice trembled when she added, "You're not the first people to come here because of Susan Miller." When they left, she stood by the gate, watching their truck disappear down the road. The silence that followed was suffocating. Inside the house, she noticed the faint smell of gasoline near the shed. Panic surged as she rushed outside. The side of the building was scorched. Someone had tried to set it on fire. The flames hadn't caught, but the message was unmistakable. This was no longer about intimidation through words or paperwork. This was escalation in its purest form. She called Emily again, her voice shaking. "They're getting desperate," the lawyer said after a long pause. "We'll file for a restraining order and push for criminal charges if we can prove intent. But Caitlin, you need to be careful. People like Susan don't handle exposure well. She's losing control, and that makes her dangerous." Caitlin hung up and sat on her porch until dawn, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, staring at the smoldered patch of grass by the shed. She felt fear, but underneath it burned something steady and cold, a kind of resolve that felt heavier than anger, deeper than outrage. The next day, she installed new cameras, brighter lights, reinforced locks. She contacted Leo Carter, the journalist, and told him everything that had happened since the injunction. Within a week, another article appeared, this one titled "Retaliation and Cover-Up." HOA under scrutiny after court order violation. It detailed the attempted vandalism, the false reports, the escalating harassment. The piece went viral, spreading far beyond their small county. Other residents from neighboring communities began reaching out, sharing similar stories about fraudulent permits and intimidation tactics. What Susan had tried to contain through fear was now spilling into public view, but exposure didn't stop the harassment. It only changed its tone. Now Susan played the martyr, claiming that she and her family were being terrorized by false accusations. Her supporters grew louder, more aggressive. One evening, as Caitlin drove home, she found her driveway blocked by a pickup truck. A man stepped out, holding a sign that read, "Protect our community. Stop the lies." He shouted at her as she tried to pass, his face red with anger. "You're ruining this neighborhood," he yelled. Caitlin didn't respond. She drove slowly forward until he stepped aside, his glare following her like a stain. That night, as she sat by her window watching the dark outline of Susan's house, she realized something profound. She had entered this fight believing she was defending her water, her home, her rights, but it had grown into something larger, a struggle against the kind of quiet tyranny that thrived behind polite smiles and legal jargon. The HOA was just the mask. The real power was in fear, the silent compliance of those too afraid to challenge it. And Caitlin, tired and scarred as she was, had already crossed the point of no return. She wasn't just defending her property anymore. She was exposing a system built on deceit, and for the first time, she understood that this fight might destroy her before it ever ended. The day of the final hearing arrived under a gray, heavy sky that seemed to press down on everything, as if even the weather understood what was at stake. Caitlin stood at the courthouse entrance, her reflection trembling faintly in the glass doors. She looked different from the woman who had first walked into this fight months ago, thinner, sharper, her expression calm but carved with fatigue. Behind her, Emily carried a binder filled with documents, recordings, and sworn statements. Across the parking lot, Susan Miller emerged from a black SUV surrounded by her attorneys, every inch of her appearance curated for control. Her white suit gleamed even under the dull light, a calculated symbol of innocence. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that glance, Caitlin saw not confidence, but something else, an awareness that the facade was cracking. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with restrained tension. Reporters filled the benches, their pens poised. The county investigator, now cooperating with the state attorney's office, had submitted a preliminary report revealing that multiple properties managed under Susan's HOA had indeed been illegally connected to private wells. Several of those connections traced directly back to the same contractors Susan had hired. When the hearing began, her lawyers tried to deflect, arguing that the installations had been misunderstandings or volunteer efforts to stabilize community resources during drought conditions. But the judge, a stern woman with years of experience dealing with bureaucratic corruption, wasn't impressed. She leaned forward and asked the question that no one on Susan's team seemed ready to answer. Why do every one of these falsified permits share the same digital signature belonging to your office login, Mrs. Miller? For a few seconds, the silence was absolute. Then one of Susan's lawyers stammered about administrative errors, claiming that multiple employees had access to the account. But Emily was ready. She rose, her voice steady as she presented an email thread recovered from the contractor's backup drive, in which Susan personally approved unauthorized redistribution lines and instructed her associates to keep communication off the HOA server. The courtroom murmured. The judge's expression hardened. Emily handed over the printed emails, then played the audio recording Caitlin had captured months ago. The conversation in Susan's backyard, where she and the county clerk had discussed closing the renewal window before Caitlin could contest the forged easement. Hearing her own voice exposed before the court stripped Susan of the polished composure she had worn like armor. Her jaw tightened, her hands clenched at the table, and for the first time, she looked small. When Caitlin took the stand, her testimony was measured, deliberate. She described discovering the trench, the sleepless nights, the forged documents, the harassment that followed. She spoke not like a victim, but like a witness cataloguing the anatomy of a crime. The defense tried to provoke her, suggesting she had exaggerated events or tampered with evidence. But Caitlin remained composed, her exhaustion transformed into a quiet authority that even the courtroom felt. When asked why she had persisted despite threats, she replied simply, "Because it wasn't just water. It was about someone believing they could take what wasn't theirs and make me grateful for it." That line landed heavier than any document could have. By the time closing arguments began, the weight of the evidence had crushed any pretense of innocence. The judge called for a recess before issuing her ruling, and during that brief pause, Susan turned to Caitlin with a stare that carried years of entitlement and disbelief. "You think you've won something here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've just ruined yourself. No one will buy property in this community now. You've poisoned it for everyone." Caitlin met her gaze, calm and unflinching. "No," she said quietly. "You did that yourself." When court resumed, the ruling came swift and decisive. The judge declared the easement forged and void, the resource connections illegal, and the HOA's conduct an egregious abuse of authority. Susan Miller was removed from her position, effective immediately, and referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation on charges of fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of public resources. The HOA was ordered to compensate Caitlin for damages, legal fees, and emotional distress, while the county launched a formal audit into its dealings. As the gavel struck, a single sound that echoed like a release of pressure, Caitlin closed her eyes. She felt no triumph, only the quiet weight of vindication. Justice, when it finally came, wasn't glorious. It was heavy, necessary, cleansing like rain after a long drought. Outside, the courthouse steps were a blur of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Emily shielded her from the worst of it, guiding her through the noise toward the car. Reporters demanded statements, asking if Caitlin planned to move away or sue further. She said nothing. Words felt useless now. What mattered wasn't what she could say, but what had already been proven. Behind her, Susan's team scattered, their composure dissolving as news of pending indictments spread. Susan herself lingered at the top of the steps, surrounded by a shrinking circle of supporters, her expression vacant as if she still couldn't comprehend that the world she had built through manipulation had finally collapsed. When Caitlin reached home that evening, the first thing she noticed was the silence, the real kind, deep and uninterrupted. The pump was still. The air felt light again, washed clean by the rain that had started to fall just as she left town. She stood at the edge of the porch, watching droplets ripple across the wooden boards. For months, water had been the weapon used against her, a symbol of control and exploitation. Now it returned as something pure, belonging to no one, cleansing everything it touched. She closed her eyes, letting the rain soak her hair, and for the first time since all of this began, she didn't feel hunted. She felt free. The weeks that followed the verdict moved slowly, as if time itself was relearning how to exist without tension. The neighborhood that had once seemed hostile grew strangely quiet, stripped of the rigid control that had defined it for years. The HOA board resigned one by one, their glossy promises replaced by nervous apologies and thin attempts at reconciliation. The county investigation expanded, uncovering more instances of falsified permits and siphoned utilities, revealing that Susan's actions had been part of a broader network of corruption. For Caitlin, none of it brought satisfaction in the way victory stories often promised. Justice, she discovered, did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion finally allowed to settle, like standing on scorched earth after a storm and realizing that survival itself was enough. She spent her mornings in the garden again, tending to the herbs and vines she had neglected during the months of conflict. The sound of the wind through the trees was no longer a reminder of danger, but of balance, the steady rhythm of a world returning to normal. Sometimes neighbors she had barely spoken to before would stop at her gate, hesitant but sincere, offering quiet words of support. Some admitted they had believed Susan's lies. Others confessed they had been too afraid to oppose her. Caitlin never held it against them. Fear was a language she now understood intimately. She only nodded, thanked them, and went back to her work. Forgiveness wasn't spoken. It existed in the space between silence and renewal. One evening, she walked down to the well, the same place where everything had begun. The repairs were finished, the new casing gleaming under the fading light. She placed her hand on the metal and felt the faint vibration of water moving deep below, steady and alive. It no longer carried the sound of intrusion or theft. It was hers again, simple, honest, and free. For a long time she stood there, breathing in the scent of wet soil and distant rain, until the first stars appeared above the ridge. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry echoing through the dark, wild hills. It didn't sound lonely. It sounded like a reminder that the land was always bigger than those who tried to own it. When Caitlin finally turned back toward the house, her porch light glowed warm against the deepening dusk. The fight had cost her more than she had imagined. Time, trust, and a kind of innocence she would never regain, but it had also given her something quieter and stronger. She had faced a system built on intimidation and walked away unbroken. As she stepped inside, she heard the faint hum of the repaired pump begin its slow, rhythmic cycle, steady and controlled. This time, the sound didn't fill her with dread. It was simply the sound of life continuing, unclaimed, untaken, and finally at peace.